The rhythmic patter of rain against worn concrete punctuated each of Jamal Carter's steps as he trudged home from school. At 14, his lanky frame already carried the weight of responsibilities far beyond his years, a backpack stuffed with honors textbooks slung over one shoulder, and the mental load of family obligations pressing down on the other. "Just 3 more blocks," he muttered, pulling his thin jacket tighter as February's chill cut through the faded fabric. The hood did little to keep the persistent drizzle from finding its way down his neck, but Jamal was used to making do with what he had. East Meadows wasn't the kind of neighborhood that appeared in tourism brochures. Apartment buildings with peeling paint stood alongside corner stores with security bars across their windows. But what the area lacked in glamour, it made up for in heart. This was where neighbors still checked on each other during storms, where Miss Jenkins from 4 Billion still made sweet potato pies for the kids at Christmas, and where Jamal's mother had managed to create a stable home despite every obstacle thrown her way. But today, like most days, Jamal needed to get home quickly. His 9-year-old twin siblings, Zora and Zamir, would be waiting for him to help with their homework before their mother returned from her second job at 8 p.m. Between her shifts at the hospital cafeteria and evening cleaning work, she relied on Jamal to be the man of the house, a role he embraced with quiet determination. His science teacher, M.S. Pearson, had pulled him aside after class today. "With grades like yours, you could get a scholarship to Bradford Academy next year," she had told him, her eyes bright with possibility. "Their pre-med program is exceptional." The thought had warmed him momentarily. Becoming a doctor had been his dream since he was 7, when the kind Dr. Martinez had treated his asthma in the ER and shown him how a stethoscope worked. But Bradford Academy was for kids whose parents drove luxury cars, not for boys from the East Side whose mothers worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Lost in thought, Jamal almost missed the elderly man standing in the middle of the road, rain soaking through his thin pajamas. Cars swerved around him, honking angrily, but the man didn't move. He simply looked around, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Hey, sir," Jamal called out, jogging toward him without hesitation. "Sir, you're in the road." The man turned slowly, his eyes cloudy and unfocused beneath a shock of white hair plastered to his forehead. Despite his disoriented state, there was something dignified about his bearing, like a king who had wandered far from his throne. "I'm looking for Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that wasn't entirely from the cold. "Have you seen Margaret? She said she'd meet me at the park." Jamal glanced at his watch, then at the dark clouds overhead, and made a decision that would alter the course of 2 lives' forever character development. Jamal Carter had been 7 years old when he first decided to become a doctor. It wasn't just Dr. Martinez's kindness in the emergency room that night, though the gentle way he'd explained asthma while letting Jamal listen to his own breathing through the rend. Stethoscope had made a profound impression. It was also watching his mother, Letitia Carter, come home exhausted after 12-hour shifts at Mercy Hospital, where she served meals to patients but could barely afford basic health care for her own family. "Doctors help people get better, Mama," he'd announced that night, his small chest still tight from the asthma attack. "I'm going to be one so I can make you better when you're tired." Letitia had smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pride and a mother's private heartache. "You can be anything you put your mind to, baby," she'd told him, smoothing his forehead with hands rough from work and worry. 7 years later, Jamal held fast to that dream with a determination that impressed his teachers and occasionally worried his mother. He maintained a 4.0 GPA despite the challenges of East Meadows High School, but where metal detectors at the entrance and occasional lockdown drills were as much a part of daily life as algebra and literature. 3 of his childhood friends had already dropped out or been pulled into the neighborhood's drug trade, but Jamal walked a narrow path between worlds, respected enough to be left alone, focused enough to stay clear of trouble. His daily routine was a carefully choreographed ballet of responsibilities. Up at 5:30 a.m. to help get the twins ready for school. A quick breakfast while reviewing flashcards for whatever test was scheduled that day. The 30-minute walk to school because the bus fare could be saved for more essential needs. 7 hours of classes where he sat in the front row of every room. raising his hand often enough to be noticed, but not so much that he'd be labeled a teacher's pet, a delicate balance in a school where academic achievement wasn't always celebrated. After the final bell, chi, ball, au pao. There was usually tutoring, either receiving advanced help in subjects he'd need for pre-med or providing it to younger students in the school's peer mentorship program. Then the walk home, grocery shopping when money allowed, dinner preparation, helping with the twins' homework, and finally, late at night, his own studies until exhaustion claimed him. The twins, Zora and Zamir, were bright spots in his life, curious, energetic 9-year-olds who looked up to their big brother with unabashed admiration. Zora had inherited their mother's practical nature and organizational skills, but while Zamir had a creative streak that transformed cardboard boxes into spaceships and mathematics into adventures. They were too young to fully understand the financial tightrope their family walked each month, and Jamal was determined to preserve their childhood innocence as long as possible. Across town in the stately neighborhood of Oakwood Drive, Dr. Robert Wilson's life had followed a very different trajectory. For 40 years, he had been one of the most respected neurosurgeons at Memorial Medical Center, pioneering techniques that had saved countless lives and mentoring generations of young doctors. His elegant colonial home with its blue exterior and white trim had hosted medical conferences, charity galas, and intimate dinner parties where the city's elite discussed art, politics, and the latest medical breakthroughs over fine wine. Margaret, his wife of 38 years and a retired literature professor, had been the perfect partner in both his professional and social life. When cancer took her 3 years ago, the house had fallen quiet, and something in Robert Wilson had dimmed. Still, he had maintained his dignity and independence, taking long walks through the neighborhood, attending symphony performances, and occasionally guest lecturing at the medical school. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago. Early onset Alzheimer's, a cruel irony for a man who had spent his career studying and treating disorders of the brain. His son, Dr. Marcus Wilson, chief of neurosurgery at Boston General Hospital, had flown in for the consultation, his face grim as he reviewed his father's scans with the diagnostic team. "We can slow the progression," the neurologist had explained gently. "But you know as well as I do what the long-term prognosis is." Dr. Robert Wilson had nodded with the clinical detachment of a physician receiving data. "I've watched this disease steal my patients' minds for 40 years, he had said quietly. "I just never thought I'd experience it from the inside." The arrangement had seemed reasonable at first: a part-time caretaker, regular check-ins from neighbors, weekly video calls with Marcus. But Alzheimer's rarely progresses in a linear fashion. There were good days when Robert seemed almost his old self, discussing complex neurological concepts with perfect clarity. But then there were days when he forgot to eat, when he called his son by his long-dead brother's name, when he searched the house for Margaret, but convinced she was simply in another room. The disease was becoming increasingly common in their community, particularly among the aging population. Support groups had formed at the local senior center, and the medical center had established a dedicated memory care unit. But for those in the early stages, like Dr. Wilson, there was that precarious period of semi-independence when they were too functional for full-time care but too vulnerable to be truly safe on their own. And so it was that on this rainy February afternoon, the paths of Jamal Carter and Dr. Robert Wilson crossed two lives from opposite ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, but brought together by chance, compassion, and a disease that recognized no boundaries of class or achievement. The encounter. Jamal took a cautious step onto the rain-slicked street, holding up a hand to slow an approaching car that was already veering around the confused elderly man. But the driver shot Jamal an impatient glare before speeding away, sending a spray of dirty water across both their legs. "Sir, it's not safe for you to be standing in the road," Jamal said, gently taking the man's elbow to guide him toward the sidewalk. Up close, he could see that the man's pajamas, expensive-looking navy silk with piping along the edges, were completely soaked through. His feet were clad only in leather slippers, now waterlogged and stained. The elderly man allowed himself to be led to safety, but his eyes remained distant, scanning the empty park across the street. "Margaret always wears a red coat," he murmured. "Have you seen a woman in a red coat?" She said she'd meet me by the fountain at 3 o'clock. Jamal glanced at the park's rusting playground equipment and graffiti-covered benches. There was no fountain, and certainly no woman in a red coat on this miserable February afternoon. I haven't seen her, he replied carefully. Maybe she's somewhere dry because of the rain. The man's shoulders slumped. Perhaps. She doesn't like to get her hair wet. Margaret has beautiful hair. His voice carried equal measures of affection and distress. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he looked directly at Jamal with sudden clarity. I seem to be a bit turned around. Do I know you, young man? No, sir. My name is Jamal. I was just walking home from school and saw you out here in the rain. He hesitated, noticing the man's increasingly violent shivering. You're getting soaked. Do you live nearby? Can I help you get home? The elderly man frowned, a flash of uncertainty crossing his features. Home, he repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, I should go home. Margaret will worry. But Jamal felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, probably Zora wondering where he was. He should keep walking, maybe call 911 to report a confused elderly person and let the professionals handle it. His mother had warned him about getting involved in other people's business in this neighborhood. It could lead to trouble. But something about the dignity in the man's bearing, contrasting sharply with his vulnerable state, made Jamal hesitate. The same instinct that had driven him toward medicine, the desire to help, to heal, wouldn't let him just walk away. Sir, what's your name? Jamal asked, pulling off his own jacket and holding it over the man's head to provide at least some protection from the rain. Wilson, the man replied, straightening his posture slightly. Dr. Robert Wilson. The title caught Jamal's attention. You're a doctor? Neurosurgeon, Dr. Wilson corrected automatically, a hint of professional pride breaking through his confusion. Chief of neurosurgery at Memorial for 22 years. Then his certainty wavered. Though I believe I've retired now. Margaret thought it was time. Jamal made a quick decision. Dr. Wilson, do you remember where you live? Your address? The elderly doctor's face contorted with effort, but Oakwood Drive, he finally said. The blue house with white trim. Number he trailed off, frustration evident in his expression. That's okay, Jamal said quickly. Oakwood Drive is a start. Do you remember the house number, or maybe what's near your house? Dr. Wilson closed his eyes, his wet eyelashes clumping together. But 1652, he said suddenly. 1652 Oakwood Drive. There's a large oak tree in the front yard. Margaret named it Ferdinand. A small smile touched his lips at this memory. That's great, Jamal said encouragingly, though inwardly he processed the information with concern. But Oakwood Drive was in the opposite direction from his apartment, in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in town. What was Dr. Wilson doing wandering alone near East Meadows, over 2 miles from home? Jamal pulled out his phone and quickly texted Zora, going to be late. Helping someone. Start homework, I'll explain later. But then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned his full attention to Dr. Wilson. Wilson. Sir, Oakwood Drive is quite a ways from here. I think we should call someone to pick you up. Is there family I can contact for you? Dr. Wilson's face clouded again. Marcus is in Boston. He's a surgeon too, you know. Very busy. Important work. Then his eyes widened in alarm. I don't seem to have my phone, or my wallet. He began patting his soaked pajama pockets frantically. It's okay, Jamal said soothingly. They're probably at your house. Why don't we head that way, and we can get you dry and warm? The doctor stared at him suspiciously. But are you with the hospital? Did Marcus send you? Jamal recognized the paranoia that could accompany confusion in elderly patients. But his grandmother had shown similar symptoms before she passed. No, sir. Like I said, I'm Jamal. I'm a student at East Meadows High. I want to be a doctor someday. I just want to make sure you get home safely. Something about this explanation seemed to resonate with Dr. Wilson. A future doctor, eh? What specialty interests you? Jamal smiled, grateful for this moment of lucidity, and began guiding Dr. Wilson gently in the direction of Oakwood Drive. I'm interested in emergency medicine. Maybe pediatrics. As they walked, Jamal kept the conversation focused on medicine, finding that Dr. Wilson was most coherent when discussing his former profession. The elderly doctor would occasionally slip back into confusion, asking about Margaret or becoming distressed about being outside in his pajamas, but Jamal had discovered a strategy: redirect rather than contradict. Yes, it's unusual to be out in pajamas, he would agree when Dr. Wilson became self-conscious. But we'll be home soon, and you can change into something more comfortable. When Dr. Wilson became fixated on finding Margaret, Jamal would gently suggest, maybe she went back to the house because of the rain. Let's check there first. The journey took nearly 45 minutes, with several stops when Dr. Wilson became tired or particularly disoriented. Twice, Jamal had to persuade him not to turn around and go back to the park. Once, the elderly doctor became agitated, insisting that someone was following them, a symptom Jamal recognized as part of the disease rather than a real threat. Throughout their slow progress, Jamal kept one supportive hand on Dr. Wilson's elbow, both to steady him on the slippery sidewalks and to prevent him from wandering off. He matched his pace to the older man's shuffling steps, speaking clearly but never condescendingly, finding a delicate balance between respect for the distinguished physician Dr. Wilson had been and compassion for the vulnerable man he now was. As they turned onto Oakwood Drive, the change in surroundings was dramatic: large houses set back from the street, manicured lawns, luxury cars in circular driveways. Dr. Wilson became more animated, recognizing familiar landmarks. There's Dr. Peterson's house, he's a cardiologist, you know. Excellent surgeon, though his backhand in tennis is deplorable. A moment of normal conversation followed by, is Margaret walking with us? I thought I heard her voice. No, sir, it's just you and me, Jamal replied patiently. Can you tell me which house is yours again? The blue one, Dr. Wilson said confidently, then pointed to a stately colonial with white trim near the end of the block. There's Ferdinand the oak tree. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Margaret thinks it's silly to name trees, but Ferdinand has been there longer than our house. He deserves the respect. As they approached the property, Jamal noticed concerning details: newspapers piled on the porch, untrimmed hedges, and an overall air of neglect that stood out in this meticulously maintained neighborhood. It confirmed his suspicion that Dr. Wilson had been alone for some time without proper care. Do you have your key, Dr. Wilson? Jamal asked as they reached the front door. The doctor patted his wet pajama pockets again, looking confused. I must have left it inside. Jamal tried the door handle, finding it unlocked, another worrying sign. Looks like we're in luck, he said with forced cheerfulness. Let's get you inside and dried off. As they stepped into the foyer of what had once been a showpiece home, Jamal made a silent promise to himself. He would see this through, make sure Dr. Wilson was safe, warm, and properly cared for before heading back to his own responsibilities. Something told him that today, this was exactly where he needed to be. Complications. The interior of Dr. Wilson's home told a story of gradual decline. What had clearly once been an immaculate showcase now bore the unmistakable signs of neglect. But dust had settled on the antique furniture, mail was scattered across a marble-topped entry table, and dishes were piled in the sink visible through the kitchen doorway. The walls, however, still displayed a lifetime of achievements: framed medical degrees, awards from neurological associations, and photographs of Dr. Wilson in surgical scrubs, surrounded by medical teams. Let's get you some dry clothes, sir, Jamal said, carefully guiding Dr. Wilson through the foyer. Yes, the elderly doctor agreed, suddenly aware of his soaked state. Margaret will be upset about the carpet. Jamal gently led him toward what appeared to be the master bedroom, where he helped Dr. Wilson locate fresh clothing, an ordeal complicated by the doctor's insistence that someone had rearranged his closet. In reality, the walk-in closet was in disarray, with clothes haphazardly hung and several items on the floor. While Dr. Wilson changed in the adjacent bathroom, Jamal quickly sent another text to Zora, still helping elderly man. "Will be later than expected. Tell Coach Jensen I can't make practice." His phone rang almost immediately. It was Zora. "Jamal, where are you?" His sister's voice carried the forced maturity of a child who had grown up too quickly. "Mum called and said she's picking up an extra shift. She won't be home until after midnight." Jamal closed his eyes, feeling the weight of competing responsibilities. Tonight was the team's final practice before the district championship game, where college scouts would be present. Coach Jensen had made it clear that missing this practice meant not starting in the game, a devastating blow to Jamal's hopes of athletic scholarships. "I found an elderly man with dementia wandering in the rain," he explained quickly. "I had to help him home, and now I need to make sure he's safe before I leave. Can you and Zamir handle dinner? There's leftover chicken in the fridge." He could hear Zora sigh, not in annoyance, but with the resigned acceptance that defined their family's approach to hardship. "Yeah, we got it. But Jamal coach is going to be mad." "I know," he said quietly. "I'll deal with it later. Love you guys." As he ended the call, Jamal noticed a leather portfolio on the nightstand. It was open to reveal medical documents with the letterhead of Memorial Medical Center's neurology department. His eyes caught phrases like early onset Alzheimer's, rapid progression, and recommend full-time care. The most recent document was dated just 3 weeks ago and contained a neurologist's concerns about Dr. Wilson's ability to safely live independently. Another paper listed contact information for Marcus Wilson, son, with notes about a home healthcare arrangement. Jamal frowned. There was clearly supposed to be someone here taking care of Dr. Wilson, but the state of the house and the doctor's wandering suggested this person was long gone. The bathroom door opened, and Dr. Wilson emerged in fresh clothes, looking more composed but still disoriented. "I thought I heard voices," he said, a hint of suspicion creeping into his tone. "Just me on the phone with my sister," Jamal explained. "Dr. Wilson, do you have a caretaker who helps you? Someone who should be here with you?" The elderly doctor's brow furrowed. "Eliana comes in the mornings, or is it afternoons?" He waved his hand dismissively. "She's not as thorough as Margaret would like, always leaving dishes in the sink." Jamal nodded, piecing together the situation. "When did you last see Eliana?" Dr. Wilson's eyes clouded with confusion. "Yesterday? Last week? Time is slippery these days." His shoulders slumped as a moment of awareness seemed to break through. "Sometimes I lose days." The vulnerability in his admission made Jamal's decision for him. He couldn't leave the elderly doctor alone, not until he'd contacted the son and ensured proper care was arranged. Looking at his watch, he calculated it was already past 5 p.m. Basketball practice had started 15 minutes ago. His phone vibrated with a text from Coach Jensen. "Where are you, Carter?" "This is mandatory practice. No show, no start on Saturday." Jamal stared at the message, feeling the dream of athletic scouts and potential scholarships slipping away. But looking at the confused elderly man before him, the choice was clear. "Are you hungry, Dr. Wilson?" he asked, pocketing his phone. "I noticed your kitchen could use some attention. How about I make us something to eat while you rest?" Relief washed over the doctor's face. "That would be very kind. Margaret usually handles the cooking, but she must be out today." As Jamal guided Dr. Wilson to a comfortable armchair in the living room, his phone vibrated again. This time it was his mother. "Jamal, Zora said you're helping someone? Are you safe?" Her voice carried the familiar mix of concern and exhaustion. "I'm fine, Mum," he assured her. "I found an elderly man with Alzheimer's wandering near school. He's a retired doctor who lives alone, and I think his caretaker abandoned him. I can't leave him like this." There was a pause, then his mother's voice softened. "You have your grandmother's heart, baby. Do what you need to do, but keep me posted." "Thanks, Mom. The twins okay?" "They're resilient, like all the Carters," she replied. I'll try to get home earlier if I can. After ending the call, Jamal moved to the kitchen and began clearing the accumulated dishes, creating space to prepare a simple meal. From the living room, he could hear Dr. Wilson alternately humming to himself and carrying on a one-sided conversation with his absent wife. While searching for ingredients, Jamal found an alarming sight: a weekly pill organizer with multiple days of medication untaken. Among them were the Alzheimer's medications, blood pressure pills, and other critical prescriptions. The situation was more serious than he had initially realized. As he assembled sandwiches and heated some soup he'd found in the pantry, Jamal made a decision. He would stay as long as needed tonight, even if it meant sacrificing his position on the basketball team. Some things were simply more important than sports or scholarships. The sound of his phone chirping with Coach Jensen's final warning barely registered as Jamal arranged the simple meal on a tray to bring to Dr. Wilson Connection Building. Jamal arranged the tray carefully: a bowl of tomato soup, a turkey sandwich cut into quarters, the way his grandmother had always prepared food for his grandfather, a glass of water, and the evening's medication sorted into a small dish. He'd studied the pill organizer and prescription bottles meticulously, making sure to match each colorful capsule and white tablet to its proper schedule. "Dinner is ready, Dr. Wilson," he announced, placing the tray on the coffee table in front of the elderly doctor, who had been staring at a framed photograph of a younger version of himself standing beside a graceful woman with silver-streaked dark hair. Margaret had hair like midnight with stars scattered through it, Dr. Wilson murmured, still looking at the photograph. "That's what I told her on our first date." Terribly poetic for a man of science, but it made her smile. Jamal sat on the ottoman across from him. "She looks beautiful," he said sincerely. "Is that from your anniversary?" Dr. Wilson's eyes cleared, focusing on Jamal with sudden recognition of his surroundings. "On 30th, we went to Venice." He set the photograph down carefully and eyed the tray. "Did you prepare this?" "Yes, sir. I hope it's okay. I didn't want to be too intrusive in your kitchen." The doctor picked up a quarter of the sandwich, examining it with the careful attention of a scientist. "My son used to cut his sandwiches this way, but said it made them taste better." He took a bite, then gestured to the medication. "Those for me?" Jamal nodded. "Your evening medications, according to the schedule on your organizer." There were several days missed. Dr. Wilson sighed, a sound weighted with his full awareness of his condition. "Eliana was supposed to manage those." "I suspect she's gone, isn't she?" "It seems that way, sir. Not the first caretaker to quit. It's difficult watching a mind unravel." He picked up the medication and swallowed them with a sip of water, his movements suddenly precise, and practiced a glimpse of the surgeon he had once been. "You said your name is Jamal, and you want to be a doctor?" "Yes, sir. Emergency medicine interests me most." Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. "Frontline medicine. Critical decisions under pressure. It requires quick thinking and steady hands." He studied Jamal's face. "You have good hands. Surgeon's hands." Jamal felt an unexpected swell of pride at the assessment. "I never thought about surgery." "The brain is the final frontier," Dr. Wilson said, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a lecturer. 3 pounds of tissue that contains everything we are: our memories, our abilities, our personalities. His expression darkened. "And when it betrays you, you become a stranger even to yourself." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, until Dr. Wilson placed his spoon down with deliberate care. "I operated on a boy about your age once. A car accident had caused a subdural hematoma. Everyone said he wouldn't survive the night." A faint smile touched his lips. "He graduated medical school 12 years later. Sent me a copy of his diploma." "That must have been incredibly rewarding," Jamal said, genuinely fascinated. "The greatest privilege of medicine is standing at the intersection of science and humanity," Dr. Wilson replied, his words carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Technical skill matters, but compassion, that's what transforms a good doctor into a healer." He fixed Jamal with a penetrating gaze. "You showed compassion today. Not many would stop for an old man in the rain." Jamal shrugged uncomfortably. It was the right thing to do. The right thing that too few people do, Dr. Wilson countered, then suddenly frowned, looking confused. Thomas, when did you get back from school? Jamal's heart sank at the abrupt shift. I'm Jamal, sir, not Thomas. Dr. Wilson blinked rapidly, his features contorting with effort as he tried to reconcile his perception with reality. Of course. Forgive me. Thomas was my son. My firstborn. I didn't know you had 2 sons, Jamal said gently. Thomas died during his 2nd year of medical school. Aneurysm, the cruel irony of it. I saved so many, but I couldn't. His voice broke, and for a moment the distinguished physician disappeared completely, leaving only a grieving father in his place. Marcus never wanted medicine. He chose it after Thomas died. Felt it was his duty to continue the Wilson legacy. But the weight of this confession hung in the air between them. Jamal found himself reaching out, placing his hand over the elderly doctor's weathered one. I'm very sorry about your son. Dr. Wilson turned his palm upward, grasping Jamal's hand with surprising strength. You remind me of him, not in appearance, but in spirit. He had that same quiet determination in his eyes. He held Jamal's gaze, fully present in this moment of connection. Whatever path you choose in medicine, never lose that compassion, young man. Technical skills can be taught, but compassion that comes from the soul. The doctor's words resonated deeply with Jamal, validating something he had always felt but couldn't articulate. In this unlikely encounter between a confused elderly physician and a teenager from East Meadows, something profound was being exchanged: wisdom, recognition, but a passing of the torch from one generation of healer to another. As they sat together in the fading light of evening, the barriers of age, race, and circumstance seemed to dissolve, leaving only this connection, fragile but genuine, but the unexpected but somehow meant to be. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times as Jamal helped Dr. Wilson prepare for bed. He'd found clean pajamas in a dresser drawer and turned down the covers on the king-size bed that took up most of the master bedroom. The doctor moved with the mechanical habits of long-established routine, though he paused occasionally, momentarily lost in his own home. I should brush my teeth, he murmured, finding his way to the ensuite bathroom. Margaret insists. Says a dentist's son should know better. Jamal waited patiently, standing in the doorway to ensure the elderly man didn't become confused. When Dr. Wilson emerged, he seemed smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that struck Jamal deeply. Will you be here when I wake up? Dr. Wilson asked, his voice carrying the innocent uncertainty of a child. No, sir. I need to get home to my family, Jamal explained gently. But I'll make sure someone checks on you tomorrow. Once the doctor was settled in bed, Jamal returned to the living room and picked up the leather portfolio he'd noticed earlier. Inside, he found the contact information for Marcus Wilson, along with notes about the care arrangement that had clearly fallen apart. Taking a deep breath, Jamal dialed the number. The name. Dr. Marcus Wilson, a deep voice answered after 3 rings. Hello, sir. My name is Jamal Carter. He kept his voice steady, explaining how he'd found Dr. Wilson wandering in the rain, the state of the house, and the untaken medications. I think his caregiver might have quit without notice. The silence on the other end was heavy before Marcus Wilson responded, his voice tight with what sounded like concern mingled with guilt. I had no idea it had progressed this far. The agency assured me he trailed off. Thank you for helping my father. I'll catch the first flight out tomorrow. Could I get your contact information, Jamal? I'd like to thank you properly when I arrive. After providing his number and address, Jamal wrote his information on a notepad by the phone, adding a brief note explaining to Dr. Wilson who he was and that help was coming. He checked all the doors were locked, left a glass of water by the bedside, and reluctantly prepared to leave. The streets were dark and quiet as he began the long walk home, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He'd missed basketball practice, potentially sacrificing his starting position in the championship game. But as the weight of that loss settled over him, Jamal realized he felt no regret, only a curious sense of purpose. This, as if he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking the surprise. The final bell rang at East Meadows High, releasing a flood of students into the February afternoon. Jamal shouldered his backpack, still heavy with the textbooks he hadn't had time to review last night, and made his way through the crowded hallway toward the exit. Carter. Coach Jensen's voice cut through the noise. The tall man stood with arms crossed by the gymnasium doors, his expression unreadable beneath his ever-present baseball cap. Jamal approached, bracing himself for the conversation he'd been dreading all day. "Coach, about yesterday." "You missed mandatory practice," Jensen stated flatly. "Yes, sir. There was an emergency. I found an elderly man with Alzheimer's wandering in the rain, and I had to." Jensen held up a hand. "Your sister explained when she called looking for you. Noble thing you did." He fixed Jamal with a pointed stare. "Still can't start you on Saturday." Jamal nodded, accepting the consequence. "I understand, Coach." But Jensen continued, his stern expression softening slightly. "You'll play second quarter. Those scouts will still see what you can do." He clapped Jamal on the shoulder. "Some things are more important than basketball, son. You made the right call." Relief washed over Jamal as he headed out of the building. The sacrifice hadn't been as severe as he'd feared, and the approval in Coach Jensen's eyes had been worth more than he expected. As he walked the familiar route home, his phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Marcus Wilson, arrived in town. "My father is receiving medical attention. May I stop by to speak with you this afternoon?" Jamal replied with his address, wondering what Dr. Wilson's son wanted to discuss. Perhaps there were questions about his father's condition, or maybe he was upset about a stranger entering their home. By the time he reached his apartment building, a weathered 4-story complex with peeling paint and a perpetually out-of-order elevator, Jamal had pushed the impending visit to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the algebra homework he needed to help Zamir with. He was halfway through explaining quadratic equations to his increasingly frustrated brother when Zora called from the window. "Jamal, there's a Mercedes stopping out front. A really nice one." The entire Carter family moved to the window, watching as a sleek black S-Class sedan pulled to the curb. It was so obviously out of place in their neighborhood that several neighbors had already appeared on their porches and balconies, observing with undisguised curiosity. "That's probably Dr. Wilson's son," Jamal explained, suddenly self-conscious about their modest apartment with its mismatched furniture and water-stained ceiling. He wanted to talk about his father. "The man you helped yesterday?" his mother asked, hastily wiping her hands on a dish towel. She'd taken a rare afternoon off after working until 2 a.m. "Should I make coffee?" "Mom, it's fine. He probably just wants to ask a few questions." The building's intercom buzzed, and minutes later, a commanding knock sounded at their door. Jamal opened it to find a tall man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than their entire apartment's furnishings. Despite the obvious differences from the elderly Dr. Wilson, the resemblance was unmistakable in the sharp, intelligent eyes and the dignified bearing. "Jamal Carter?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Marcus Wilson." Jamal shook his hand, feeling suddenly younger than his 14 years. "Yes, sir. Please come in." Dr. Wilson entered, nodding respectfully to Jamal's mother and smiling at the twins, who stared at him with undisguised fascination. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for welcoming me into your home. I won't take much of your time. Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Letitia offered, her natural hospitality overcoming her evident exhaustion. "Water would be lovely, thank you." Dr. Wilson turned back to Jamal. "Is there somewhere we might speak privately for a moment?" Jamal led him to the small balcony off the living room, the only semi-private space in the cramped apartment. They sat on mismatched patio chairs, the stark contrast between Dr. Wilson's tailored suit and the peeling paint of the balcony railings impossible to ignore. "First, I want to thank you for what you did for my father yesterday," Dr. Wilson began, his voice grave. "The new in-home caretaker I hired apparently quit without notice last week, and my father didn't tell me like he forgot, given his condition. Jamal nodded. How is he doing today? Better. I've arranged for him to be evaluated at Memorial, where he practiced for most of his career. The staff there, Dr. Wilson's composed facade cracked slightly. Many of them trained under him. It was difficult for them to see him in this state. He looked out over the neighborhood, gathering himself before continuing. What you did yesterday was extraordinary, Jamal. Many people would have called 911 and continued on their way. But you didn't just get him home, you stayed with him, made sure he ate, took his medication. You showed him dignity and respect. Jamal shrugged uncomfortably under the praise. It was the right thing to do. The right thing that not enough people do, Dr. Wilson countered, echoing his father's words from the previous evening. I spoke with your mother this morning while you were at school. Sane? She told me about your aspirations to become a doctor, about the scholarship opportunity at Bradford Academy. Yes, sir, though it's a long shot. Dr. Wilson's expression became thoughtful. Not as long as you might think. You've already demonstrated the quality that makes an exceptional physician genuine compassion. From inside his suit jacket, he withdrew an envelope and handed it to Jamal. This isn't charity, he said firmly, as if anticipating objection. Consider it an investment in the future of medicine. Solution. Jamal stared at the envelope in his hands, uncertain whether to open it. Go ahead, Dr. Marcus Wilson encouraged, his voice gentler than before. With careful fingers, Jamal unfolded the document inside. The letterhead belonged to the Wilson Family Foundation, and as his eyes scanned the contents, his breath caught. It was a formal letter establishing an educational trust in his name, one that would cover his full tuition at Bradford Academy and, should he maintain his academic standing, continue through undergraduate and medical school. I don't understand, Jamal whispered, looking up at Dr. Wilson with wide eyes. This is too much. Is it? Dr. Wilson asked, leaning forward. My father practiced medicine for over 40 years. In that time, he saved countless lives and trained generations of neurosurgeons who went on to save many more. His legacy extends far beyond our family. He gestured to the document. This isn't just about what you did for him yesterday, though that alone would merit gratitude. It's about who you are and who you can become. Tears threatened at the corners of Jamal's eyes, but he blinked them back. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept not just the financial support, but my mentorship, Dr. Wilson replied. I've spoken with the leadership at Bradford. You'll start in the fall with a full scholarship. In the summers, if you're interested, there's an internship at Memorial's community outreach program. Nothing too clinical yet, but it will give you valuable exposure to hospital operations. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't charity, it was opportunity, recognition, a door opening that Jamal had only dreamed of walking through. I accept, he said, his voice steadying with conviction. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Please call me Marcus. The older man smiled, revealing a warmth that hadn't been visible beneath his professional demeanor. There's one more thing. I've arranged for my father to move to Oak Ridge Memory Care Center. It's the best facility in the state, with an excellent staff-to-resident ratio and physicians on site. Jamal nodded, relieved to know the elderly doctor would receive proper care. That's good to hear. He asked about you this morning, during one of his lucid periods, Marcus continued. Called you the young doctor with compassionate eyes. He'd like to see you again. He hesitated. I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider visiting him occasionally? Your presence seems to have a positive effect on him. Of course, Jamal replied without hesitation. I'd like that. Over the following months, as winter yielded to spring and then to summer, a new rhythm established itself in Jamal's life. His academic performance at East Meadows High earned him honors at graduation and secured his place at Bradford Academy for the fall. The financial burden that had weighed so heavily on his mother's shoulders eased with the scholarship, allowing her to reduce her work hours and spend more time with the twins. Every Sunday afternoon, Jamal took the bus to Oak Ridge Memory Care Center, where he would find Dr. Robert Wilson waiting in the garden or the community room. Sometimes the elderly doctor recognized him immediately. Other times, he would greet Jamal as if meeting him for the first time. But regardless of Dr. Wilson's mental state on any given day, their conversations always eventually turned to medicine. On good days, the retired neurosurgeon would share intricate details of procedures he had pioneered, his hands moving with the precise gestures of a surgeon as he described complicated operations. On difficult days when confusion clouded his thoughts, Jamal would simply sit with him, sometimes reading aloud from medical journals or from the memoir Dr. Wilson had published a decade earlier. Marcus often joined them, and a bond formed between the three, a surrogate grandfather, father, and son united by their connection to medicine and to each other. What had begun as a chance encounter in the rain had blossomed into a relationship that would profoundly shape the trajectory of Jamal's future conclusion and life lessons. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come from the smallest decisions. For Jamal Carter, the choice to stop and help an elderly man in the rain might have seemed like a simple act of human decency, the kind of thing anyone would do. Yet in our increasingly disconnected world, such moments of genuine compassion have become remarkable rather than routine. What Jamal couldn't have known on that rainy February afternoon was how this single act would ripple outward, transforming not just the life of Dr. Robert Wilson, but his own future as well. In stepping off his familiar path to help a stranger, he unwittingly stepped onto a new path, entirely one that would lead him toward his dreams with support he could never have imagined. Life rarely unfolds according to our careful plans. It is shaped instead by these moments of choice, these intersections where our values are tested and our character revealed. For Jamal, what could have been just another day of navigating his responsibilities became the day that changed everything. Perhaps most beautiful in this unexpected connection was the bridge formed between generations, the wisdom of age meeting the promise of youth, but each enriching the other in ways neither could have anticipated. Dr. Wilson found dignity and recognition through Jamal's respect, while Jamal found mentorship and opportunity through the Wilson family's gratitude. Their story reminds us that in a world that often feels divided by differences, compassion remains our most powerful point of connection.